breathe. To be alive, remain alive, breathe. To feel free of restraint, breathe. Is this what liberation tastes like? Breathe. Fresh air exposition, breathe. Rest after exertion, I can't breathe.
Hold up! It doesn't have to be like this. Imagine, what if Richard had been met with a tow truck in that parking lot instead of an armed police officer?
You okay?
Or what if Brianna and Ayana had slept peacefully through the night instead of being murdered in their beds? Or if a mental health professional had responded to the call about Kayla? What if they would have just let Elijah dance? What if my brother Monty got the treatment he needed instead of a jail cell? We are the largest and most diverse movement in the history of the world, and we are determined to create a future in which we don't have to imagine. Let me show you how.
The BREATHE Act starts by ending federal funding of the police and moving to divert funds away from the punitive agencies like ICE and the DEA. No more tanks rolling through our city streets, no more children in cages, no more over-policing of Black and brown neighborhoods, life sentences over dime bags, no more wrongful convictions of innocent people, while abusers with money are left to go free again and again and again. This system, designed only to punish and cage, is not keeping us safe. It is not working for us.
The BREATHE Act isn't only about defunding. In fact, that's just the beginning. Where are we going to put our money instead of police and prisons? By establishing federal incentives for cities and states, the next part of BREATHE allows communities to create new, non-carceral models of public safety on their own terms. These could be healing justice programs, violence and abuse interruption programs, or job opportunities for formerly incarcerated people like me. The BREATHE Act would allow these ideas to grow and expand.
So the thing that makes the BREATHE Act really exciting is that it goes beyond the scope of how we traditionally view public safety. It's important that the right person shows up in an emergency. And we also need to build infrastructure to ensure that our communities are able to thrive day in and day out. That means access to healthy food and good jobs that pay a living wage and cleaning up our neighborhoods that have been poisoned for generations. That means providing housing to families, children, and all of our people who've been living in tents and in cars and who've been sleeping on the streets. That means disrupting the school to prison pipeline and making sure that our children have access to quality schools that are nurturing, safe, and supportive. And that means economic innovation in communities, including piloting universal basic income programs.
Some of these names you know, many you don't. Each of these people died at the hands of our criminal legal system. They were loved, they were cherished, and their lives mattered. Their deaths have moved me and many others to fight with everything we have to end police violence and to make the BREATHE Act a reality. That's why BREATHE calls for reparations and accountability to the Black community and all those impacted by state violence. Repairing the harm done already is not a footnote, but an essential measure for progress. Finally, BREATHE includes provisions to enhance self-determination in Black communities by strengthening voting rights and ensuring that all Americans are able to have a voice in our democracy. In the words of the late, great John Lewis, let us walk together with extraordinary vision and go make some necessary good trouble.
Hello, everyone. I am so glad that you are tuned in today for the CSRN Teach-In, because we have a phenomenal, and I mean phenomenal, presenter today. I've known Rashaya for a few years now, and no matter where I see her, she is shaking the table and hitting the drum for justice. And let me just read you a little bit about Rashaya, because she is literally going to change your life with her talk today on the history of policing. So, attorney Rashaya G practiced criminal defense and family law in Ohio at the municipal, state, and appellate level for several years. She has tried both misdemeanor and felony cases to verdict in jury and bench trials, and successfully briefed and argued appellate cases. After leaving private practice, she teaches race and American law as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Toledo College of Law. She also works as a senior staff attorney for Advocating Opportunity Incorporated, a nonprofit law firm that holistically represents human trafficking victims. Rashaya helps AO center racial justice in its anti-human trafficking representation. Her scholarship focuses on intersectionality and the power relationships related to gender, race, culture, poverty, trauma, human trafficking, and constitutional law. Specifically, her work considers the tangible ways in which the law legitimizes identity as a social reality and as a hierarchical system. She was a 2018 and 2020 TEDx Toledo speaker and has lectured all over the country about America's racial trajectory. Attorney G attended college and graduate school at University of Toledo, earning her BA in political science and an MBA in finance. After earning her master's degree, she moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she graduated from the University of Minnesota Law School with honors. She is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, sits on local boards, and is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She and her husband have a 6-year-old daughter, and you can follow her on Instagram at Advocator, and that's spelled ADVAKATOR. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my extreme pleasure and joy and excitement and lot in life to introduce you all to the amazing Rashaya G.
Hello! Yeah, my face is big. I didn't expect it to be this big. That's nice. Hi!
Oh my gosh. All right.
Can I give a little caveat, because I want to make sure that I'm accurately and appropriately setting up folks who are going to participate in today's lecture, which is just that my discussion about policing will be specifically related to the Black community, right? So I want to make sure folks don't think that they're coming to get like an overview of how policing has evolved and when they started using broken windows policing and when broken windows policing went out of style. Like I'm not going to talk about that specifically. I am going to talk about how policing as an institution has come to be understood within the Black community. Okay. Kind of those historical tensions, because I think that that's necessary in order to understand where we are today. And so hopefully I'm hoping that our discussion today will add some context to what's happening right now in our country and help people to think about some of the issues around policing that we're discussing today. So I wanted to make sure people knew that.
Okay. And Rashaya, I'm going to give the screen completely over to you.
Awesome.
For anyone who is watching, if you have questions or if you have comments, you can drop them in the chat. And as we receive them, we can bring them up on screen. And then we can, if you want to double back to them once we're done with everything, then we'll do that.
That might be easiest because maybe people will have questions while I'm speaking, but if they let me finish, I might get to them.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll just hold on until the end.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
All right. Fantastic. Right. So policing started. The first actual policing agency was in Boston in the mid 1600s. It was called the Boston Watch. And it was the equivalent of like a neighborhood watch group. Right. But in the South, right, policing originated with slave patrols. Right. And almost all white men were required to participate in these patrols. So you see very early on this country's kind of conflation of whiteness with state-sanctioned authority over Black people, over Black bodies, right? During slavery, law enforcement interacted with slaves for essentially two purposes. A, to investigate and subvert any attempts of escape or rebellion, and B, to catch fugitive slaves and return them to bondage or to murder them. There's a book called Been in the Storm So Long by Leon Litwack, and it describes the responsibility of slave patrols this way. They were responsible for slave control off of the plantation. That's obviously akin to law enforcement's function today. Law enforcement doesn't really police private space unless they're invited in, or unless there's some type of emergency necessitating their intervention. Two, they were in charge of investigating rumors of insurrectionary plots, which is an investigative function that cops still have, right? If they receive some type of information that they believe leads them to some type of criminal conduct, they begin an investigation. Essentially, at that point, the criminal conduct was slaves attempting to escape. They seize runaways, right? Which is equivalent to serving warrants, right? Warrants for arrest. They break up clandestine slave gatherings, right? Keeping the peace. And they punish Blacks off of the plantation who did not have proper paperwork, right? So show us your ID, right? Show us your permission to be in this space. Litwack argues that slaves feared the slave patrolmen as, quote, legal terrorists who went out their way to inflict brutalities and humiliation on any Black people they encountered. That's on page 28. All of this kind of begins to sound reminiscent of what you hear Black people complaining about today, right? This idea that officers harass them, that they're frequently stopped, that they're frequently frisked, that they are frequently searched, right, without probable cause. Right. Harvard history professor Khalil Mohammed, he wrote the book, The Condemnation of Blackness. That entire book chronicles the policing history in this country of both the North and the South. He talks about slave patrol statutes in that book, and the statutes outline the duties of slave patrolmen. And so I'm going to give you some language from one that a slave patrol statute in Louisiana in 1835. It required slave patrolmen to arrest any slaves, even if they have a permit, if you find them in the woods with fire or a torch, right? You are to arrest them and you are to punish them with corporal punishment, not more than 30 lashes, right? So even in the genesis or the very beginning of this kind of formation of policing in this country, you see a variety of things happening. You see this conflation of whiteness with this kind of deputization of authority over Black bodies. Right, you see this idea that the police not only have the responsibility to capture, to enforce slave laws, but also to administer punishment, right? To administer those 30 lashes right there on the spot. So this idea that police have the authority to regulate Black bodies, not even just in terms of stopping them, questioning them, asking for verification, but also with punishing them on the spot, right? These ideals are very much baked into fabric of American policing. Okay, so after slavery, right, slave patrols were largely originated in slavery. After slavery, we have convict leasing, right? This era of convict leasing. And convict leasing is where slavery-like conditions were resurrected through policing measures, right? Essentially, we passed a slew of laws that largely were enforced against Black people, Black men especially, and essentially return them back to chains, right? And so the seminal work on convict leasing is Douglas Blackmon's. I have his book here. It's called Slavery by Another Name. Pulitzer Prize winner, incredibly meticulous, incredibly well researched. And in his book, he talks about convict leasing. He talks about the laws that essentially characterize convict leasing. And Blacks would be seized, taken to a designated townsperson, found guilty, and then sentenced to hard labor on a plantation or for another private entity. Douglas' book essentially starts off with the story of Cottenham. And he says in his book, Cottenham had committed no true crime, vagrancy, the offense of not being able to prove at a given moment that he or she is employed, was a flimsy concoction dredged up from legal obscurity at the end of the 19th century by Alabama and other southern states. It was capriciously enforced by sheriffs and constables, adjudicated by mayors and notaries, and it was reserved almost exclusively for Black men. Blackmon's book also details other horrors perpetrated by law enforcement during the convict leasing era. Among some of the most ridiculous offenses that Black folks were policed for included speaking too loudly in the presence of a white woman. Right. Blackmon further acknowledged that in addition to racial animus, the enforcement of these laws was motivated by a desire for free labor and an attempt to intimidate Black men away from political participation. And I like to contextualize these discussions. I hope I'm not going too fast. I have 8 pages here. I'm not going to get through all 8, but I have 8. So I'm trying to cover as much material as possible. But another point that's really important to help contextualize this discussion is that during this period, you're talking about shortly after slavery, right? So in 1867, we have the Reconstruction era begin, right? And in many of these states, Blacks are the majority of the population. South Carolina, Mississippi, the majority of the electorate are Black people. You see 2,000 Black people elected to political positions during this period, right? And so it was very clear that if the Black populace continued to vote and continued to participate in the political process as much as they had been, that laws were going to change that were going to democratize the power dynamics of that situation. And white people were very afraid of that. White men were very afraid of that. And so they began these concerted efforts to disrupt the political participation of Black people. And so convict leasing very much is related to the desire to smother Black political participation. Right. It's important to remember that what you have here, if we're talking about slavery since the 1600s, what you have here is at this point over 200 years of state-sanctioned authority regulating the conduct of Black bodies specifically, right? Of Black people specifically, of criminalizing Blackness, right? After convict leasing, you have the era of Jim Crow, right? And what Jim Crow did, Jim Crow was largely a response to the Reconstruction era. It essentially codified many of the practices that had become common during the convict leasing period, right? And so many of those practices, including prohibitions on prohibitions that hindered political participation, codifying many motivations in terms of in the employment of Black men. This period in American history is undergirded by extreme racial violence against Black people. In the form of lynching specifically, the EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, that's ran by Bryan Stevenson. They erected an entire memorial to lynching And so if you haven't seen it or if you haven't done any research, also Without Sanctuary is a great website that's essentially photographs of lynchings, some in which people are posing in them. And so lynching, the fear of lynching largely characterized much of this era. And what's important for people to remember is that what you see here is kind of twofold in terms of law enforcement. Not only are law enforcement failing to protect African Americans during this period, but they're also very much participating in the extrajudicial violence, right? So, and I want to make sure that I cannot overstate this point. Sorry, excuse me. Not only do you have this history of state-sanctioned authority being given exclusively to white men to police Black people, but you also have these periods after slavery where we were supposed to be free from bondage, where Black people are being subjected routinely to extrajudicial violence, and the police are not helping them. Right. So I think that this does a ton to sever the idea or to undermine or disrupt this idea within the Black community that the police are a place of safety, that the police are an entity for protection. Right. Because historically, during our most troubling periods, during the periods where we were most vulnerable to vigilante violence, the police did, in fact, not protect us. Right. That is very much a tenor of the relationship between the Black community and the police, right? What you simultaneously see, though, in this period, and we talked a little bit about earlier how there is a conflation of whiteness with a state-sanctioned authority over Black bodies, but you will also see this equating of Black skin with criminality, right? Think about the periods where, I'm sorry, I have this on my leg. I should have put it on the table, but it keeps moving. So I'm sorry if I'm making folks who are probably motion sick from all the moving. But what you also see, though, is this equating of Black skin with criminality, because think about the justification of arresting Blacks who had been victims of violence, right? There are instances where, for example, a Black family moved into a predominantly white neighborhood, and then they were attacked essentially by the neighbors, by the neighborhood wanting them to leave. If the police responded to that attack, the overwhelming majority of the time sided with the mob, right? The white mob, not with the Black victim family. That family often was arrested, right? Those people were often arrested, right? And what's the justification for the arrest? They aren't arresting them as victims, right? They were often characterized as being troublemakers, right? And so this idea that Blackness, in fact, there were lawsuits filed for people moving into neighborhoods, and the lawsuits alleged that their being Black was the nuisance, right? So that race became synonymous with disturbing the peace, right? Disturbing the peace. After Jim Crow, you have the Civil Rights era. And we've all seen the images of civil rights marches. We've all seen what Bloody Sunday looks like, especially in light of the fact that John Lewis recently passed, and those images were being broadcast nationally. Jim Crow, civil rights was a response to the Jim Crow laws that prevailed all over the country, certainly in the South, but at least de facto in the North as well. Right. And so what you had was Black folks essentially engaging in civil disobedience, Black folks marching for their rights, Black folks attempting to effectuate the suffrage that they had been granted with the 15th Amendment, right, that they had not been able to access historically. And you see the police very much being an adversary to their efforts, right? So we all understand as a society that the civil rights movement was a movement about equality, was a movement of largely African-American people attempting to assert their equality and their rights, right, their civil rights. What we don't talk about, though, is what the police's role in that process was, how the police responded to that. We've all seen the images of police dogs and hoses and police using their batons, right? We've all heard the stories. If you are interested in the history behind this, if you're interested in some specific examples, there's a book called Race Against Time, which investigates unsolved civil rights murders. There's also a podcast that does something similar called White Lies. And all of them talk explicitly about the ways in which sheriff and local law enforcement participated in the murders of civil rights leaders in the South, and participated in the cover-up of those civil rights leaders' murders, right? And so the police were very much a part of the civil rights movement, but just on the opposite side. They were the adversary of those heroines and heroes that we frequently talk about. Martin Luther King was arrested, just numerous times, right? Numerous times. And so what's really interesting to me is that folks are often unable to reconcile their ideas of police as heroes, essentially, and above criticism, with the notion that this very entity was largely responsible for attempting to thwart the civil rights movement, in large part by force, by violence often. So the civil rights movement, it was the police who brutally disrupted peaceful marches, right? It was the police who vigorously enforced segregation. It was police who helped cover up murders of prominent civil rights leaders. And I've already talked about Race Against Time and White Lies. After the civil rights era, you have the Black Power movement, right? And during the Black Power movement, this is an attempt to self-actualize and self-determination, which is really rhetoric that had come from the white community, right? All you have to do is do it yourself, right? If you do it yourself, you'll be fine, right? And this was very much also a response to the civil rights movement. There were Black people who felt as though the civil rights movement was too passive, right? And killing Dr. King seemed an affirmation of that, right? Many, many people within the movement for racial justice felt like Dr. King was the most mild of all leaders, right? They felt like he was not a threat in any way. And so his death, to a lot of people, signified not only are they not willing to give us the equality we're asking for, they're not even willing to give us the equality King is asking for. And that's a bare minimum, right? And so the Black Power movement was kind of birthed out of this frustration that we've been attempting to appeal to the conscience of white America, and all it did was assassinate King. And so let's do something that we know will protect us. The police have not and will not protect us. We have to protect ourselves. And that was essentially the foundation of the Black Power movement. And what you saw was Black people attempting to take care of one another through free food programs and through taking up arms, right? They opened schools, they gave away lunches, they armed themselves to mobilize against the racial terror that cops had failed to protect them from. You know how that went, right? In fact, the only time the NRA has ever supported a ban on assault weapons was when the Black Panthers stormed the Capitol with them, right? And so that's the only time it's ever actually even happened. So after the Black Power movement, you have mass incarceration. I should say too, if I can go back to the Black Power movement, you saw surveillance and police disruption at an all-time high. If you haven't looked into COINTELPRO, you absolutely should. COINTELPRO is a shortened version of of counterintelligence program. And it essentially was an attempt to thwart the Black Power movement at all cost, by sowing deception. Google it and be amazed. Mass incarceration. Right after the Black Power movement, you will see the emergence of the war on drugs, the rhetoric of law and order, really emerging as a dominant narrative in the policing trajectory. We all know about the unwarranted disparities in crack and powder cocaine, an explosion of our prison population, disproportionately of Black and brown people, the devastation of poor and minority communities. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow is a seminal work that chronicles this. The police were the front lines of this effort, right? The police were the front lines of this effort. All of this boils down to a simple point. There has never been a period in history of this country where the police were allies of the Black community, or where the police helped the journey of the Black community, or where the police were a partner in our quest for justice, equality, and full personhood. There has never been a period in our history. So one of the things I think is really, really interesting is when I hear people say things like, well, we just need to rebuild trust between the Black community and policing. And my response is always, can you tell me any era in the history of this country where trust existed in the first place? Right? So this idea that we need to rebuild trust is certainly a mischaracterization. There's never been trust. Right? Similarly, when people say, well, it's just that policing is broken, right? My response is usually, well, can you give me an era where it was fixed? Right? Can you give me an era where it was whole? Right? Because I think that it's important for us to be honest about the history of police if we're going to ever move forward, right? And the analogy that I think will help to bring this point home, one of the things my family is doing right now is watching family-friendly Halloween movies together. And recently we watched The Night Before Christmas with my daughter. And if you've never seen the movie, it's essentially a Halloween town. A town all about Halloween. All of the townspeople are Halloween people. They have some function in Halloween, and horror is infused into this town in every way, right? And the main character of this story essentially is bored with Halloween. And so he decides instead of doing Halloween, they're going to do Christmas this year, right? And so he goes through all the motions. He gets a red suit. He wants to pass out gifts. He explains that he gets a tree, blah, blah, blah. But the crux of the movie is the way in which Christmas is distorted through this Halloween town's eyes, right? And what I think is really applicable and what's really helpful to help us understand the position we're in with policing is that because this town's framework was so heavily influenced and understood through the lens of Halloween, they weren't really in a position they weren't capable of completely getting rid of that fundamental framework and embracing Christmas in the way that Christmas is traditionally, right? Similarly, right, once the framework of your organization is heavily infused with a particular perspective, a particular history, a particular function, a particular belief system, that belief system doesn't just go away, right? Or you can't just shake it off. Almost everything you do will be understood and channeled through that framework. And that's the place that we're in with police. This framework, the framework of Blackness being criminalized, the framework of essentially white authority over Black bodies, this is baked into the foundation, right? This idea of punishing on sight, this idea of being able to accost people and presume that they're doing something wrong is very much part of the fiber of policing, right? And so this idea that we're just going to be able to say something or pass a piece of legislation and the police are all of a sudden going to be able to radically transform is certainly probably not true. It's certainly probably not true, right? And the reality is that this isn't the first time we've been in the place that we are right now as a country, right? We have studied and talked about policing in minority communities to death. Watts riots in 65, New Jersey riots in 67, national riots after King died in 68, LA riots in 92, Ferguson in 2014, Baltimore in 2015, Portland, Minneapolis, Toledo in 2020, right? Cleveland in 2020, right? Almost all of these incidents have produced some type of commission or report, hundreds of pages. And every time this happens, every time there is international coverage or national coverage of police brutality, and there's an uprising in response, almost always the government convenes some type of commission to study it, to issue a report. We know these things. We've studied these things. Right? We know what's happening. We know what the problem is, and we continue to start all over, right? So essentially, the question this all boils down to is, will white people, because white people are the people with the control over policing, Black people don't control the police, right? Are white people willing to reimagine public safety and create a different version of public safety, even if the one we presently have is working for them? Right? Because it's not working for everyone. So I tend to break down responses to this in two different ways. One, changes to substantive law, and then two, questions about even if something is legal, is it right? Is it appropriate? Right? And so those are two different ways we can respond. But I'm going to stop and attempt to answer some type of questions if there are questions, so that I don't blabber too far along. So yeah, that's history of policing in a nutshell.
I told y'all. I told y'all.
I was trying to. Oh, I forgot to say something. Can I say something else? You don't have to go anywhere, Ruth.
Okay.
You don't have to go anywhere, but I forgot to say something. The other thing that continues to happen is police themselves have said much of what Black folks are saying, much of what folks who are advocating for police reform. There's a great book. It's by Norm Stamper. He was a police officer on the San Diego Police Department starting in 1966. He started as a police officer in 1966. He became the chief of police in Seattle in 94. And he has written a book called Breaking Rank. There's actually a chapter in here, 2 chapters in here actually, about race and policing. I just want to read like maybe a paragraph of what he says. He talks about, I've studied fear for years. I've learned how it affects our bodies, our perception, judgment, actions. Recently, I tried to dig up empirical evidence to support my particular theory that white cops are afraid of Black men. Right? He says, why am I certain that white cops are afraid of Black men? Because I was a white cop in a world of white cops for 34 years. Right? At first, I was afraid of everyone, white, Black, old, young. I got over most of those fears pretty quickly, which is to say, I repressed them, but not, however, my fear of Black men, not for a long, long time. As a rookie, I felt a peculiar and particular fear every time I stopped or ticketed or arrested a Black man, a fear I did not feel when confronting white men under similar circumstances. He also talks about racism within the ranks. He has an entire chapter on it, but largely he says much of what Black folks have been saying. I was actually recently talking to a local scholar who I won't name because I didn't ask him if I could, but he was also on the police force for decades, retired from policing, went and got his PhD and studied the intersection of race and the use of force. That's actually what he goes around training on now. And he specifically said to me that the entire time I was policing, if you had asked me, I would have told you I'm most likely to die at the hands of a Black man. And he says, and I believed that until I did the research and found out for myself. So I think part of the problem too is that at least Black folks, especially Black folks who study this, don't feel like we're having authentic conversations, because when we talk to police outside of their policing capacity after they've retired or whatever, and they're able to be more candid, they usually confirm and echo many of the concerns that Black folks are having right now, which is that the police have an irrational fear of Black people that causes them to react in a way that's disproportionate to the situation and puts Black people in danger because they have an erroneous belief that Black people are more likely to be criminals and are more dangerous than the rest of society. So where should we start?
Told y'all. Okay, so first things first. Wow. Okay, so I have a few notes, but I just want to say the one line. So 2 things. The first thing, and then we'll get to some questions. The first thing is, I feel like I've heard you say this before, but your statement that there has never been a period in American history when the police have been on the side of the Black community.
Yes. Yes. I mean, literally, if you think about it, the perceptions and the sentiments that Black folks have been expressing, or that folks have been seeing Black people express recently, is the natural and logical conclusion of that historical relationship, right? Like, how else would you expect Black people to regard the police in light of this centuries long history where the police were created as adversaries of Black people, right? And have maintained that positionality up through, if you wanted to argue, up through at least the 19th century, right? So this this is the logical conclusion of a relationship that's largely been characterized by terror.
I mean, it's true. Okay, and then the second thing. So I have never seen, is it The Nightmare Before Christmas?
Yes.
Okay, so I've never seen that movie, and I am going to watch it, and I'm going to relate everything to the police.
Yeah, well, and so the movie is, I actually just recently watched it, but this wasn't the first time I seen it. It was the first time I watched it with my daughter. And it's so interesting. They have like, he wants reindeer, but they're skeleton reindeer, right? He has gifts that he goes around passing to kids, but the gifts attack the kids, right? They're like dead heads and stuff, because this town understands holidays in these terms, in only the terms of Halloween. So what they do is essentially map on Halloween onto Christmas, right? Like we'll make gifts, but they'll be scary gifts, right? We'll make reindeer, but they won't be, it's not this idea of being jolly. It's this idea of being horrific, right? And it's because they are not able to conceptualize what holidays look like outside of their framework. So they infuse that framework into every other holiday. And similarly, right, the police have a particular framework. They have a particular history. That history is very much how they envision policing, right? They cannot divorce the execution of policing from the framework that they presently have. And again, that framework, in terms of its relationship to Black people, has been one of adversaries.
All righty. Let's take some questions from the audience. So you went through a lot of books.
I did.
And you gave a lot of titles. And so I think it'll be easiest if after all of this is over, we can like really sit down and go through.
I know, I'm sorry.
But are there a few that that you really think are like the best place to start for someone who's just getting into the history of policing?
Yeah, so Professor Muhammad's book, he's a Harvard University history professor. I think he's specifically associated with the Kennedy Center and the Center for Race and Public Policy. His book, The Condemnation of Blackness, is essentially all about policing and Blackness.
Okay.
That's the entire book. And it chronicles very meticulously it draws parallels between policing in the North and policing in the South, particularly as it relates to Black people. And essentially his thesis of the book is that Black people have always been controlled by the state with force and violence. And that force and violence, the agent of that force and violence has been police. And also that the evolution of that policing has resulted in criminality being imputed to Black skin. So The Condemnation of Blackness is good. Norm Stamper, Breaking Rank. That's the name of that book that I talked about, being written by the former chief of police of the Seattle Police Department. He goes through a litany of things in the book, policing and domestic violence, policing and drugs, but there's also a chapter in there on policing and Black men. And I think it's useful to have that perspective from a white former chief of police. A Slavery by Another Name. That book is all about convict leasing, but before it gets into convict leasing, it talks about the genesis of policing. It talks about how informal policing was, and how it gradually grew it grew to be more formal as the need for, or the perceived need for, social control of Black people increased, right? So the freer Black people became, the more formalized policing became. It talks about how police didn't originally have uniforms, right? But part of an attempt to give them some prestige, and an attempt to more closely align them with military, they began to get these uniforms. I think that's also in The Condemnation of Blackness. What else do I have here? Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow is a fantastic book on policing. So yeah, that's where I would start, those books.
Okay. Alrighty. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm just typing them into the comments.
Go ahead.
And we'll post links to, I'm fairly certain, I can't think of the name of the bookstore off the top of my head, but there is a Black-owned bookstore that you can order from online that will keep the money within the Black communities. Okay, so we have a question another question. And if you have any questions, you can simply type them in the chat and they'll pop up, or you can email them to csrntoledo@gmail.com. But this question is from Julian Mack, and he says, how does policing in America with race differ from other countries? What makes other nations better at dealing with police violence, and how do we fix this?
So a few things. I want to reiterate, I am not in any way an international scholar. I don't do comparative analysis of race between America and other countries, in part because America's trajectory is slightly different, just because I think that the history of slavery in this country and the ways in which slavery gave birth to race in this country have a unique impact on the idea of policing. Right? Because again, policing was created, the slave patrols were created in response to slavery. So policing in this country as it relates to Black people is inextricably woven into the history of slavery in a way that I don't know if that reality exists. I can't say that it doesn't. I don't know if it exists in any other country, that dynamic. So I don't know. But I don't know how we get to a place where other countries, I mean, in part, what's really frustrating for me is that we have all the information about what the problem is. If you're interested, I referenced some reports. The Kerner Commission report, it's a 1968 report. The Kerner Commission was convened by President Lyndon Johnson. As I said already, after King was murdered, there were riots all over the nation. There had been multiple issues with police even before King passed. I talked about the Watts riots in 65. There were New Jersey uprisings in 67, right? So the 60s were really marred by police brutality. We saw, Bloody Sunday was broadcast internationally. Everyone saw how the police were treating Black peaceful protesters. Mm-hmm. So the 60s were largely characterized by very public displays of police brutality and very public responses to that police brutality. And so tons of reports, hundreds of reports and commissions were created in response to that dynamic. The 1968 Kerner Commission is one report. You can Google it. It pops up online. The Lilly Report, 1967 New Jersey Lilly Report. These reports detail with incredible accuracy the problems of policing and largely indicate the ways in which policing is racist. I mean, and these are bipartisan commissions that are rendering these reports that are saying that policing is inherently racist and needs to be reformed. And then those reports just sit there. Nothing's happened, right? And so we know what the problem is. We've studied the problem. We have hundreds of reports on the problem. The bigger question is, why hasn't there been enough political will to actually get something done, right? And so when you ask me what it takes the political will of the people with the power, and we're just not seeing that.
Alrighty, so I think that you did answer it, but Brianna Camden asked, what do you believe is the first step to police abolition, or what do you believe the first step to police abolition will be? And so want to reiterate,
girl, I can't even give you the first step to police reform. I don't know. I legit don't know. I don't know. This is honestly where my limits come in, because I am an incredibly rational person. Logic dictates almost all of my decision making, right? So if you were to present me with a problem and then give me multiple 100-page reports telling me solutions to try, I'd try the solutions. Right. So we just haven't as a society. I mean, it's mind blowing. If you were to read the recommendations of the 1968 Kerner Commission's report, they are almost identical to what's being recommended right now. And so that still hasn't been implemented, right? And so I don't know what the first step of police abolition is, because I don't know the first step of police reform is. People would like you to believe that it's studying the problem, issuing a report, and coming up with recommendations, but we've done that. We've done that dozens of times, and we still haven't fixed anything. So I don't know.
Oh man, I was hoping that you could, fix policing in America.
I know. I'm sorry.
45-minute video.
I know. I feel you.
So we have one more question, and I don't know how realistic this is, but asking if you could turn that movie into a workshop for kids. And then I actually have a follow-up question, but I'll let you answer that one first.
I don't know. Actually, when I was watching it with my daughter the other day, I was thinking, this is actually legit kind of scary. I don't know if she should be watching this, because like there's a scene where like the kid opens the gift and he pulls out a head, and I'm like, well, she's 6. I don't know. So I don't know the answer to that. I actually don't even know if it's an appropriate kid movie, because I was asking myself, like, I don't know if I should be letting her watch this. So I don't know. I don't know if I would use that, but I think for grown-ups, it is a useful tool to think about how practices, beliefs, habits, traditions become so deeply ingrained in systems. And then we give those systems new solutions, those old systems new solutions, and expect them to execute effectively without meaningfully. And one of the biggest arguments of Professor Muhammad's book is that he argues that policing hasn't substantively or fundamentally changed since slave patrols. I mean, he says you can essentially compare all of the functions today to the functions of policing during slave patrols.
Right.
The only difference is now ostensibly they're supposed to evenly apply those functions to white people. But if they were created in response to a particular group of people with a particular policing target in mind, for to say to them, we'll now do that to everyone, right? And to never fully account for the ways in which the police have perpetrated terror, right? I mean, what I see when I look at old images of the 60s marches, and I see dogs on children, and I see hoses on children, and I see batons on people that are lying on the ground, that's terror, right? And as a society, we don't discuss it that way. In fact, it's almost considered blasphemous. It's considered it's considered disrespectful to talk about it in those terms, when that's exactly what it is. So as a society, if we're not prepared to reconcile our even language around policing, I mean, one of the things I was saying, I was in a reform meeting yesterday, and I was saying, we need to normalize criticism as a part of talking about the police. The fact that criticizing the police is considered disrespectful or rude is absurd to me, right? Why isn't criticizing the police normal and okay, and everybody's used to it and nobody bats an eye at it? So we're not even there as a society. Right. And so, the idea that we're in a position to radically transform is just a fallacy that we like to entertain, and that isn't supported by where we are currently in our reality.
So while we are on the topic of movies, and I'm literally backing you up a little bit, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity, because Rashaya was able to write an amazing article for the Toledo Parent newspaper. Wow. And it talks about anti-racist movies as tools for parenting. And I bring this up because not necessarily to talk about this article in particular, but the way that you were able to draw this really authentic linear line between The Nightmare Before Christmas and policing in America. Do you see that same ability in movies like Zootopia, where policing is brought to the forefront? Or do you see Zootopia as more propaganda for policing?
So, in full honesty, I don't remember Zootopia.
Okay.
I know I've seen it, but I don't think it's one of those movies I sat and watched. I think it's one of those movies I turned on and then left the room.
Okay.
And honestly, to be fully honest, I don't even remember. She might have been 3 or 4. So I don't even really remember watching it with her. Okay. Might have seen it at my mom's, and maybe I was there, but I walked out of the room, and I honestly don't remember, and I don't know enough about the facts of the movie to tell you how that movie presents in terms of policing. But one of the things I do think happens, and I'm not thinking about kid movies as much, but I am thinking about, I think a less obvious point that we don't discuss enough, is that there are Black people who are pro-police. right? I think we create this false dichotomy where it's all Black people and then all white people are, all Black people are on the side of wanting police either abolished or reformed, and all white people are on the side of wanting the police to maintain or stay in their present state. And it's much more nuanced and complicated than that. In part because Black folks have also ingested and consumed very pro-police propaganda. In fact, an article that I'm working on now, but it's in draft form, is this idea about the ways in which Black bodies have been utilized to deliver positive messages about policing without interrogating the relationship between Blackness and police, right? So if we think about some of our favorite, I love you, Ruth. If we think about some of our absolute favorite characters on big screens, on TV, they are police officers who are Black that never talk about being Black as a police officer, right? So if you think about Carl Winslow, right, from Family Matters, if you think about Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, Bad Boys, if you think about Eddie Murphy, Beverly Hills Cop, if you think about Chris Tucker in Rush Hour, right? Like, all of these folks whom we love, we've watched these movies, we've laughed at these movies, we have also consumed and began to associate Blackness with positive images of policing, even as Black folks, as Black community, without interrogating, right? Because if we think about all of those characters I just named, none of them sit and spend any time on screen talking about the inherent tension in being both an officer and being Black, right? Or how policing has treated Black people. There's no discussion of that dynamic in these films, right? It's very much, all of these people are the hero. All of these people are doing the right thing. All of these people are going by the book. All of these people are actually only pursuing criminals. They're never stopping and frisking people. They're never doing anything inappropriate. None of these people are ever innocent, right? So we are consuming very slanted messages about policing that are delivered in Black bodies who Black people love, right? And we don't interrogate what that says to us implicitly about policing, right? And so when we talk to Black people frequently, and this is an important point if you don't hear anything else I say tonight, we as a society have continued to conflate safety and policing. We say that they are the same thing. We do not recognize the ways in which police have historically been a source of danger, particularly for the Black community. And in part, I hope that that's at least more apparent when I talk about their role during the civil rights movement. But the reality is that very much throughout the history of this country, the police have been a source of terror for Black people. Right. And an inability to recognize the ways in which they are not a safety, right, for Black communities is part of the problem. Right. And so if we can disaggregate, right, or disentangle police from the idea of safety, right, and we can begin to think about if our public safety model had been created by Black people with Black people in mind, how would it look different? Right? How would it look different? And that's essentially what we're attempting to do. I've said this before. When women were attempting to effectuate gender equality in terms of sexual harassment laws, women had to define sexual harassment, right? They were not able to effectuate the kind of equality that they were looking for with the existing framework that had been created by men, right? Mm-hmm. Women had to reconfigure and reimagine what sexual harassment looked like on their terms in order for their issues and the violence against women, the sexual violence against women particularly, was happening. Black people are attempting to do the same with policing. Right? We need to be able to reconfigure public safety in a way that has our humanity at its core, because that's never been done in the history of this country. And as a result, what you have seen is the disproportionate mistreatment of Black people at the hands of state law enforcement.
Ooh, I told y'all. So it's actually really interesting that you bring up, and then we're going to jump to the next question. It's interesting that you bring up pop culture and Black bodies and how we have all of these different Black men who are representing police officers, but they never have those real conversations. Because there was a documentary series called The Blacklist that talked about, I think it was Chris Rock that was speaking about the shift in how the Black man was acknowledged between Sidney Poitier and Eddie Murphy. And he talked about how Sidney Poitier, whenever he would walk into a room, it was always, how did he put it? He said, I'm representing my race. And so you had to like have those difficult conversations and really get to the nitty gritty of the Black experience. Whereas by the time Eddie Murphy came around in Beverly Hills Cop, it was just, in essence, it was the I'm not Black, I'm OJ conversation without having that conversation. It was I'm Eddie. Like, I just happen to be a Black guy who's a cop. So that's, when you're writing that article? Is that the one you're writing?
You know what? I am working on it. Literally, okay. I need someone, listen, if you know someone, I need someone to pay me to write. Because part of the issue is I can't write because I'm not getting paid to, I get paid after I write. And it's labor intensive. Like, you got to pull a bunch of sources. You got to analyze. You got to make sure that you're using. So anyway, at least for me, it is. So I am working on it.
Okay.
It is on my list.
Okay. You know what? I'll look forward to it.
Yeah.
All righty. So we have a few more questions. This one comes from Wanda. She says, just my opinion, but at the very core, it seems that the problem is that white men are afraid of Black men. And I think that was brought up in the book that you were telling me about. What can be done with that?
I don't know. I also don't know the answer to that. The only thing that I resort back to is many Black leaders were asked this question or in some variation in the 60s, and they consistently said that's on white people, right? White people have to figure out, and we all know, if you've studied race in America at any length, you know that fear has consistently been used as a tactic to support racialized policies. A fear of the other is the linchpin of racism. And so I'm not sure how you undermine that. I don't know. Studies show that over 75% of white people have no friends of color. So that means that they're receiving a majority of their information from the media, from the news, from movies, from jokes, stories. So those kinds of representations tend to be overwhelmingly stereotypical. I'm not sure how you fix that. Even if you think, if you know anything about Robin DiAngelo's white fragility, right? She talks about frequently how we equate safety with white spaces, right? We good schools, right? And so the idea that Blackness is danger, that Blackness isn't safe, that Blackness is something to be feared, is very much ingrained into our societal fabric. Even if we think about The Birth of a Nation, which was shown in the White House under Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson referred to it as history being written with lightning, right? And so, and The Birth of a Nation was essentially a fear campaign. The entire film is about Black men posing a danger to white women. The Tulsa race riots, the Rosewood race riots were all in response to a white woman saying that she had been accosted, had been assaulted by a Black man, right? And they burned down entire cities and communities because of it. They lynched and killed dozens of people because of it, right? And so the fear that has been used to communicate to white people about Blackness is an integral part of our society. I'm not sure if there is a single solution that'll fix that.
Alrighty. Whew. Okay, so we have one last question, and then I'm going to ask you just to give me your thoughts about a TV show that I think we both watch. So our final question is, how does the abundance, this is from Julian Mack, how does the abundance of firearms in America connect to the history of policing? In your opinion, do Black folks owning more firearms historically and presently make us safer or more in danger of police violence?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question about the relationship between firearms and policing, because the genesis of the Second Amendment right to bear arms was actually a fear of governmental tyranny, right? A fear of the federal government becoming too large and posing a risk to its citizens. The way in which bearing arms has become kind of a symbolic response to civil rights movements is relatively new, right? Like even in the 60s, you didn't really see like a ton of private citizens responding with their guns publicly in the way that you do now. And we know that people got killed, right? I mean, Medgar Evers was shot in his driveway, right? So we know that people got killed with guns, but the kind of valorization of them, the kind of romanticizing that we've seen, you know, that's relatively new. I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. But I will say, though, that I think that the reality of, and one of the things I don't think I've said here, but I know I've said in other forums, is that 95% of African Americans were in the South before the Great Migration, right? So this history of the relationship between police and Black America, and people might be thinking, well, it's not monolithic because there were Blacks in the North, very small fraction. So the history and the introduction of policing to Black people was almost uniform in terms of being through the utilization of slave patrols, right? And slave patrols obviously didn't just stop slaves, right? They stopped free Black people too, because how would you know they were free unless you stopped?
Right.
And so that in the South, almost all white people, especially definitely all white men, were empowered with this policing power over Black people. Okay. And so I would think that, you know, as a society, if we've said to white people historically, you have the right and even the duty, right, to participate in this kind of policing, to keep your neighborhood safe, to keep your wife safe. I was just telling someone, there's actually a good book called They Were Her Property. And one of the things that They Were Her Property and Been in the Storm So Long talk about is how the Confederate strategy of war was largely informed by this idea that white women needed to be protected from their slaves. And so who could be sent to war? How many people could be sent to war? When Confederate forces were really suffering, they wanted to use men from the slave patrols, and that became a huge issue, right? Can we send these men from the slave patrols to fight in this war against Union forces? And if so, who's going to protect white women from these slaves, right? And so this idea of needing protection from Blackness, and this idea of all white people, all white men especially, having a responsibility to participate in that. If you were to ask me, that I would think that there would be some connection between that history and the present need to, or the present belief that you need to arm yourself against protesters, right? We know the very public couple, one of whom was an attorney, who came out on their front yard with guns when a protest passed down their street. And then the second part of his question was, we know guns don't make us safer. I mean, there's tons of data on that. I had this conversation with my husband when he got his license to carry, and we got firearms in our house, because the studies actually show that they're more likely to kill someone in your house than to kill an intruder. They're more likely to kill a child in your house than to kill an intruder. And so we know guns don't make us safer. But again, someone asked me the biggest impediment to change, and what I have been telling people and what I believe at my core, the biggest impediment to change is our mentality. The biggest impediment to change is that we are wedded to the ideas we currently have. And so it is very difficult for us to imagine something beyond what we presently have. So if you were to say to people, I'm taking away all of your guns, nothing else would matter. Not the data, not the research, not anything, because there's a visceral connection to those guns. Those guns represent safety, even if that's not a reality. And I think the same is true for police, right? There is a visceral connection to policing as we currently have it. And so people are not able to hear research, data, facts, because they are viscerally connected to the entity of policing. They have all attached that entity, that idea to their safety. And so questioning, wanting to remove, wanting to reform the police very much seems like an attack on their safety to them. And that's I don't know how you get over that.
Whew.
I know it's a lot to unpack.
It is. Goodness gracious. Well, okay, we're gonna end this. I don't want to call it on a high note, but we're gonna end it with
a question. Maki, da, da. Okay, you asked me a question. What was it?
Okay, so I know that we both love Lovecraft Country.
I do love.
Okay, so my look, I
know folks. I've seen folks who I saw some guy who was a film like major scholar, and he had all of these problems with it, and all of them were really well reasoned. But back to the point I just made about policing, right? When you have a visceral connection to something, when something feels good to you, any attack on that thing, you're very there's a knee-jerk rejection. I read it begrudgingly because I love the show so much, right? So yeah, no, I do. I like the show a lot.
Okay, so well, my first question is: have you seen the syllabus or the syllabi to go with each episode?
No, I listened to the podcast and I know the reference materials, but I have consistently asked if those materials are listed somewhere because I would love to have them. So if you have it and you've been holding out.
Never. I thought you already read them all. I'm so sorry. No.
I'd like to, please.
Okay, so there is there's a whole syllabus that goes along with Lovecraft Country, and they go through each episode. You get the songs, you get the literature, whatever the spoken word is for each particular episode. My question to you, and my final question, number one, who is your favorite character? And number two, do you have a favorite episode?
Jeez. So I'm probably say my favorite character is Tick. I'm sorry. Letty is a close second, but I know more about Tick, right? I've seen his experiences. I saw his experiences in Korea. I've seen his experiences with these various women, right? I've seen him in combat, right? And so I've seen him in his dreams, right? And so I love that Tick is a spectrum of good and bad.
Okay.
I think that is most representative of real humanity.
Okay.
And I want us to begin to love people in their entirety, the great things and the terrible things about them, because those things inform each other. And so I love that Tick is both a villain and I love both a villain and a hero. I love that he embodies both of those things. And Letty, we know she's a little aloof. We know she's kind of doing her own thing, but there's nothing really bad about Letty, right? Like aside from the fact that she didn't go to her mom's funeral and sometimes she just kind of ditches her family and does her own thing. Like there's nothing bad about her, right? Okay. So I like the characters that are complicated because I think that is a reality. So Tick is probably my favorite character. The Tulsa episode is probably my favorite episode. I very much immerse myself in the history of Black people in this country.
Okay.
And I don't think Tulsa has gotten the attention it deserves. I don't think that any of these experiences, Rosewood, Tulsa, the Freedmen's Bank, any of the instances where Black folks out of nothing created beauty, created wealth, created independence. I don't think that those instances of Black resilience have received the level of attention that's necessary. Certainly not on the kind of mainstream platform that HBO is. Certainly not with that kind of budget.
Right.
So I really appreciated how beautifully it was done, that there was still moments of beauty that were showcased. There were still moments of conflict, right? You saw this Black father beating his child for being himself, right? For expressing his sexuality in a way that he wanted to. Right. And so you saw this Black father doing this bad thing. You saw these girls on prom night. You saw beauty. You saw this regalness, this reality of this Black family who ended up being burned alive. Right. And so to see that story resurrected in such a spectacular fashion and shared with audiences who probably have not historically had access to that truth. I thought so Tulsa was my favorite episode. And yeah, Tick is my favorite character. So if I was really about it, I would say Montrose, but I can't do Montrose's like homophobia. The way he was treating his, and I shouldn't say that because I mean Tick has super homophobia, but Montrose, I need you not to have homophobia. I need you of all characters, and I shouldn't say that. Do what you need to do to keep yourself safe, but I need you to be here for it. I need you to. What is his lover's name? Why can't I remember it? Sam. I need you to love Sam. I need Sam to get more airtime. I need you to be respectful to him.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, and in Tick's defense, Montrose beating. I mean, I don't know. I would feel some type of way. So I'm not sure if his homophobia is informed by the fact how much he hates his father for what he did to him.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know. But yeah, Tick is probably my favorite character.
Okay. Well, oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Rashaya. Yes, thank you so much. This is actually our final teach-in for a little while, but we are so glad that we could close out with a powerhouse like yourself. Once again, I every time we talk, I end up with notes. I will be going to watch The Nightmare Before Christmas.
How many people got that analogy? I'm so happy because when it came to me in my head, I was like, I don't know if this is going to translate well, but we're going to go for it. But it looks like people got it. So good.
Beautiful. Like, use that everywhere else you go from now on, okay? Like, just go up there, like, let me tell you about The Nightmare Before Christmas and how that's
not going to work, right?
Yes.
Right, because we would never trust them with Christmas because we know. But we do this to policing and educational institutions and other spaces all the time. Right?
Indeed. Okay, well, really quickly, do you have anything to plug? What's up next for you? Like, what are you working on?
Yeah, one of the things I am working on is creating a subscription service to my writings and works and lectures so that hopefully I can share in community, at least on a monthly basis, with folks about things like this. We can talk about policing. We can talk about our criminal justice system. We can talk about the ways, what we were just talking about, how Blacks have created economic wealth in multiple instances, and that wealth has been taken from them without recourse and without accountability. So I'm hoping to create space so we can have these conversations more regularly, and I can arm people with the tools that they need to be able to engage in these conversations effectively and to promote change. So I am working on that, but please follow me on Instagram. That is the space where I will be sharing the stuff I have coming up.
Alrighty. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in to the CSRN Teach-In series. Once again, this is our final one for a little while. Please be on the lookout for Rashaya G's subscription service to her papers. Be on the lookout for the book list. Rashaya, I'm going to get with you so we can go through all of the titles of the books that you brought up and any suggestions you may have. Thank you, Rashaya, for doing this. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Black Lives Matter, justice or else. Peace.